Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. The last video I made between Teimour Radjabov and Alireza Firouzja was a little bit long. It's a pretty long game, but this is the light analysis, so I'm going to try to make it short and sweet for you guys. This is taking out a round one. As you guys know, we just started the rounds today. Anybody who is coming from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you, maganong umaga. Anybody who is coming from Azerbaijan, I will say salam and chaksak go for coming by and taking a look at my video. Anybody who is coming from France, I will say bonjour and merci beaucoup. Anybody who is coming from Iran or who does speak Farsi, I will say salam and khayli mamnoon. I appreciate you guys very much, but if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look, see what we have for this game, man. So we do have d4. We got knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3. And as you guys know, there are many different things you can get into. You got Catalans, Queen's Gambit declines, Slavs and stuff like that. However you want to play. Nimzo Indians, all that stuff. So we got d5, and then we do have knight to c3. We got pawn takes c4. So we do have the Queen's Gambit decline. It's the 3 knights variation, and this does allow us to get our nice center on e4. And we do have b5. Firouzja is just saying, man, I really want to hold on to that c4 pawn. So we're going to see how that goes. We do have e5, and after the knight comes to d5, we do see knight taking b5. As you guys know, one of those two pawns are pretty much going to fall. It is really, really, really hard to hold on to that c4 pawn. You pretty much need one more tempo. If you had that one tempo, then you'd pretty much be able to hold on to it. But we do see knight to b6. Black's whole focus is trying to make sure that he holds on to this c4 pawn because as of right now, the pawns are equal. So he needs to really kind of hold on to that pawn. The bishop comes up to e3. Logical move. I mean, you're just trying to make sure that this d4 pawn that supports the e5 pawn is protected. So we do see knight to c6. We see bishop to e2. Bishop goes to e7. We see castles. Knight comes down to c3. There was some tactics there trying to, maybe move rook to c1 to get that pawn. So we didn't want to leave our knight on b5. We do see rook over to b8. Half open file, so super logical, spot for the rook to be on. That's where your play is going to be coming from mostly because you are castle kingside. So we do have a3. We have knight to a5, and that b3 square is looking kind of juicy for that knight, right? You're like, hey man, why don't I just drop down in here and say hello? So we do see queen to c2. Knight goes over to d5. We see rook a to d1. And then we do see the novelty of the game, which is bishop to a6. And you guys remember what I was talking about with this pawn. So we got the knight protecting it. We got this bishop protecting it. So we're pretty much all good to go. And like I said, that knight is wanting to come down to b3 at some point. The bishop comes down to d2, and then we do see this knight to b3. We got the knight over to e4. Knight takes d2. Rook takes d2. We do have the knight down to f4. And this move can kind of be inconvenient. Normally, if you have a pawn on e5 and you are supporting this knight, it's super inconvenient. But right now, it's not too bad. But we do see bishop taking c4. And, white has managed to grab that pawn off the board. So in light of this, we have reached the point in the game that if you don't want to pause the video and see how Alireza Firouzja decides to deal with the fact he just lost a pawn, go ahead and do so. All right, so Firouzja's way that he decided to go ahead and take care of this pawn that he just lost was to actually exchange sacrifice, which is one of the most logical moves in the position. And I'll get into that in a second. But we do see rook takes b2. So if you found rook takes b2, I congratulate you because it's a really hard move to find, I think. I think a lot of people would just be like, well, I lost the pawn, and I mean, that's pretty much it. But this does deflect the queen over and undefends the bishop. So the queen does take on b2, and we see bishop taking c4, and we are hitting this rook on f1. So the rook slides over to c1. We do see bishop to d5, and I mean, we kind of have a little bit of an issue with our knight because we don't really want to move it because then that is going to be, allowing the bishop to take and mess our structure up, and then the queen is going to be coming in, and I mean, that knight would just be super great on f4. So we do see rook to e1 just defending. The queen goes to a8, adding extra pressure onto that knight, and so I mean, you still have the same issue, especially in this particular situation. You know, if you move this knight and allow this bishop to take on f3, you will be following it up with a queen move. So you kind of have to desert this pawn over here on a3 and go queen to c2. The bishop takes on a3. So you have just gotten you a nice little pawn. Knight f goes to g5, and you're literally one move away from checkmate. I mean, you know, you have checkmate on this h7 square if you could just move this knight out of the way. So if black doesn't do what they're supposed to do and defend, knight is going to come to f6 with check, and then following that up is going to be mate on h7. So the knight does come to g6, and it does the perfect job of plugging up that hole, or plugging up that threat. We see h4 because Firouzja is like, bro, I really want to checkmate you, dude. Or I mean, Radjabov is like, I really want to checkmate you, dude. And then Firouzja is like, man, let me go ahead and grab me a little bit of an exchange back. So that is what this bishop move is doing. We're going to get into like a really forcing line. We do see h5, bishop takes d2, queen takes d2. We see h6, pawn takes g6, pawn takes g5. And like I always tell you guys, if you are going to be losing a piece, or you're losing a pawn, or, you know what I'm saying, like it's going to get taken anyway, you might as well try to do as much destruction with it as possible. And the most destructive thing to do is to place a check. And that is what we see. Pawn takes f7 with check. The king takes on f7. And then we get our knight out of the way with tempo. Knight takes g5 with check, moves the king back to e8, and then we're able to play f3. And now we have literally just taken care of all of the issues that we had in our position. Because we were having this bishop plop itself onto g2, which is going to be kind of bad. So we perfectly were able to get rid of that. The king comes down to d7. Queen goes down to e2. Bishop takes e4. Rook takes e4. And then we do have queen to d5. Just doing a really good job of just blockading this pawn, basically. I mean, you know, we were looking at possibly trying to push it. So, you know, queen to d5 perfectly defends against all that. We see queen over to b4, trying to see if this rook is ticklish. And he says, I'm not. At all. So the rook sidesteps over to g8. We see queen to a4 with check. The queen goes up to c6. And then we do have queen taking a7. And this would literally not be possible after rook to a8 if you could not escape to c5. And that is what we see. So the queen goes to c5. We see queen takes c5, pawn takes c5, and then the king goes down to c6. And there is not a good way to hold this c-pawn, so you might as well try to play actively and counterattack as much as possible. So we do see rook over to g4. King takes c5, rook takes g7, king goes to d5, rook takes c7, king takes e5. And I mean, you know, they are up a pawn in this particular situation. So, you know, you got to be kind of careful because this g-pawn, you know, it can get rolling pretty quick. So we do see a really accurate move, rook to f7. One of the most important things that you want to be paying attention to when you're playing rook in games is trying to cut off the opponent's king. And that is what rook to f7 is doing. Now this king cannot step, you know, past this line right here. So your whole goal is to try to, you know, cut off the kings as much as possible so they cannot influence the game. So the king goes up to d6. We see king over to f2. We do see e5. I mean, you got to try to do something with this pawn, man. Like, you can't just leave it sitting there. So we do see g4. And after we see king to e6, rook goes down to f5. And this is a really nice setup to make sure that your rook is, you know, anchored. So we do see rook down to a3. The rook goes up to f8. We see king up to e7. We see rook over to b8. The king goes over to f7. We see rook to c8. Just getting a little closer to the king. King goes back to e7. We see rook down to c2. We do see king over to f6. Rook goes to e2. Rook goes to b3. We see rook up to e3. And, you know, white is like, dude, let's trade. You are absolutely not winning this game if you trade rooks and you are black. Because basically, because white has these connected passed pawns, this king is very restricted in where it can go. So it pretty much has to kind of, you know, make sure that this pawn doesn't get out of control. So like I said, this king is restricted. This king is not. This king can literally move wherever it wants to for the most part. I mean, you can't get too crazy and just be over here in the corner, but you know what I'm saying? You have much more freedom of movement as white, and that gives you like many more moves than black, and you can always put black in a position to where they have to make an unfavorable move, you know, put them in a zugzwang position. And so we do see rook down to b2 a check, avoiding the trade. King goes up to g3. We see the rook over to c2. Rook goes to a3. Rook goes to b2. We see rook up to a6 with check. The king goes up to f7. So as you guys notice, you know, this rook is doing a good job of kind of cutting this king off from its movement, and the same thing with this rook. You want, as white, you want this king to be like at the edge of the board. And that's not even with just king and rook in games. That's just literally period. If, like, as much as you could cut off kings from the action, you know, kings become very active pieces into the end game. So you don't want them being influential for no type of reason. So we do see rook over to h6. We see rook up to b3. And there's a very real threat of just pushing this pawn. And because this pawn is pinned to the king, you know, we're going to be winning a pawn. And that's not what you want. So the king goes back down to f2. We see the rook over to a3. And like I said, black's whole goal is to either cut this king off or to tie it down to the defense of this backward pawn. So that way, you know, this king doesn't have any movement. So those things do really good. The rook goes over to b6. King goes over to e7. We see king to e2. The rook goes over to c3. King goes to f2. The rook goes back to a3. And black's whole goal in this position is just to basically hold everything. Just to make sure that white can't advance. They can't do what they want to do. You're constantly threatening stuff, and you're just making sure that you just don't give any. And that is what Firouzja needs to do in this type of a game. The rook comes down to b2. We see king down to f6. Rook goes over to e2. Rook goes to b3. We see rook back up to e3, so we're like, you know, in a similar position as we were before. And of course, Firouzja is not trading, so the rook comes down to b2 with check. King goes to g3. The rook goes over to c2. Rook goes to b3. The rook goes to a2. The rook goes to b6 with check. So, you know, we are, you know, pretty much just floating around the same types of positions that we've been seeing. The king goes up to f7. We do see the move g5. Rook goes up to a4, immediately trying to make sure that it cuts off this king, like I was mentioning before. We do see rook over to f6 with check. The king goes to e7. We see a rook over to h6. King goes back to f7. We see the rook down to h4. And at no point ever in these endgames, when you are down a pawn, are you to trade rooks. So Firouzja is not going to fall into that. You trade rooks and the game is almost immediately over. You know, you trade rooks here, the king is moving up into a better position. And I mean, black literally has zero hope. So we do see rook up to a5. The king goes up to g4. Rook goes down to a4 with check. The king comes up to h5 and avoiding the trade again. Rook down to a3. So like I said, I mean, black is just attacking anything that they can to try to hold white into a certain position. We do see the move f4. Pawn takes f4, and we have reached a position that is drawn by agreement. And that is what ends this game. Basically, what's going to happen after this rook takes this pawn right here, this king is going to hang out on this g file pretty much between here and here. There isn't any way to force this pawn forward. This rook is going to come up to a6 and just make sure that this pawn does not ever push. And there really is not anything that you are able to do about it as white. You are not in a position to really, you know, do much. And so, I mean, even being up a pawn, you know, these types of end games, like, I mean, they're very specific to how you have to play them. So you can definitely go into like bad positions, but as long as you're playing them correctly, it's going to be very hard for either side to win these types of games. So the last video that I did of this was almost 19 minutes, which is like insanely high for me. And so I just tried to do my best to shave some time down. So I shaved about 5 minutes off the game. So I tried to shorten it and sweeten it for you so that way you can get the entire game and not get loaded up with too much information for it. So for all those chess, super duper chess fans, I will put the longer version at the end of the video in the screen, in the end screen, so that you can see the entire analysis of everything. But Meraming Salamat, Akim Makat Ibigan, Merci beaucoup, Kheli Mamnoon, Chak Sat Go, and I will see y'all next time.